Hello, my name is Eve.
My name is Sathyam.
We are doing our first podcast on the There Will Be Podcasts channel. We are going to cover multiple different films, but we are naming our channel There Will Be Podcasts after our first movie, There Will Be Blood, that we're going to discuss today.
And in
Um,
today's podcast, we'll break down the character of Daniel Plainview a little bit more. He's a very, very complex character, but he takes up most of this story. He's really the heart of this film. And so we want to talk about his resilience, his narcissism, his obsession with humiliation, and his acting and Daniel Day-Lewis's portrayal of this character in general.
yeah, and we're going to kind of aim this at an audience that isn't really film oriented like we are. Like, we're kind of film nerds. Sure that the people who watch this video are able to understand what we're talking about no matter what background they come from. So
Yeah, so as long as you've seen this movie at some point, we feel like you'll enjoy this podcast.
yeah. So you ready?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So Daniel Plainview, let's just kind of talk about his name. Daniel is a biblical name, and it's kind of funny that his last name is Plainview, given how he kind of unfolds as a character throughout the movie. So plain view, he kind of has this plain, shallow view of the world, the character does, and they so thoughtfully made his last name Plainview. We thought that was kind of interesting. I don't know if that was purposeful. It kind of seems purposeful. But yeah, he pretty much starts off the movie mining for silver, and he pretty much falls backwards, breaks his leg, and is able to crawl out of this hole in the ground and walk however long he had to walk back.
And so, from the first scenes of the movie, the viewer really gets a sense of how resilient this guy is. I mean, he's just broken his leg, he's out in the middle of the desert, and his obsession almost is with crawling back to the town so he can turn in this piece of silver and start making money. And so, going back to that name, Plainview, he has a shallow view of the world, but it's very, very focused on money. And we liked how the movie started with that scene. So, that's established early on for viewers.
Yeah, and it's not just money in the form of oil. He doesn't just have this obsession with oil. We find out early on in the movie that he's obsessed with money in any form. And he kind of goes on later on in the movie and explains that he, wants all this money so he can be alone and away from people. And we'll kind of dive into whether or not we really think that he does want to be alone and away from people, or if he's just, more complicated than that as a character.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that we both found very interesting about this film is that you can never really tell if Daniel himself is acting. And I think you have to give a lot of credit to Daniel Day-Lewis for that. But even when he talks about his family or he has those scenes where he's interacting with HW one on one, you never really know if Daniel cares about his family or the people around him.
Yeah, we kind of talked about how when Daniel sees off HW on the train, when he sends HW away to, you know, go to, we don't really know where exactly he went. We assume it's kind of like a deaf and blind school. You see very, very quickly a tear fall down Daniel's face. And we thought that was so interesting because if you blink, you don't see it. And it's almost like the film is trying to say that Daniel hides these emotions by making it so hard to see whether or not Daniel is feeling emotions in the actual film. Like, it's not just the character hiding his emotions, it's also the film hiding Daniel's emotions.
Yeah, and it's also ironic in that scene that Daniel isn't talking because a lot of his power comes from the fact that he can talk to other people and sort of persuade other people into whatever he wants. And it's one of the only scenes in the movie where he's not really talking, and you kind of get this glimpse into who he really is as a character, or who we think he really is. But like you've just said, we never actually get a confirmation of that at any point in the movie. So it's really up to the viewer to decide what they think about that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because backtracking a little bit, we didn't really start to dive into the climax, which is when the oil well exploded and, you know, HW fell off and ultimately lost his hearing. We see before that Daniel being having this facade, at least, of being a family man, and he seems to love his son and he seems to care about him. And when this happens, he's running towards the oil well, and we assume he's running because he knows that his son is there, but then he's not even the one to grab his son. And he grabs his son and he brings him back. I think he kind of realizes that there's something going on with HW's hearing, but he just puts him down. The son's begging him to not leave him, and he doesn't really care. It's almost like as soon as he loses his hearing, he doesn't care about it, but then at the same time, he's earning all this money that's basically going to make him a millionaire. So we don't really know if he loses interest in his son because he lost his hearing, or if it's because he hit this gold mine of oil, or possibly a mixture of both.
Yeah, it could be both. And I think the clearest indication of that is when the oil rig actually lights up on fire and you see this plume of fire bursting into the sky. Everyone around Daniel looks terrified, if we're being honest, if you look at their faces. And the camera kind of pans in on Daniel, and he's just got this look of admiration. And you can tell, I mean, the one thing you have to give him credit for as a character is he has this great long term vision. And you can tell in that moment, he knows he's going to be filthy rich. And so in that specific moment, that's all he can think about. And you can tell he cares about HW a little bit in the way that he holds him in that scene, and obviously in the way that he rushes him back to the workers' quarters. But as soon as he sees that oil and he realizes the potential of that land he's on, he sort of cuts out the rest of the world, as he does in several other points in the movie.
Yeah, for sure. Do you want to talk a little bit about his relationship with Eli?
Sure. Yeah. I think one thing that we found in our research and rewatch of this movie is that Daniel and Eli obviously share a lot of similarities, and in a way, they're both salespeople fighting for the attention of this town. So Daniel's way of, I guess, Daniel's sale is this oil field, and he's trying to convince the town that he alone can bring them wealth and prosperity that they've never had before. And Eli's trying to convince them that through God, they will achieve everything they've ever wanted. And I think an important distinction the movie makes, or I guess the lack of distinction, is that both of these people are con men. And Daniel even calls Eli out after HW goes deaf, and he asks him why he can't heal HW, and the obvious answer is because Eli is not a magic man. In the same way that Daniel is not some miracle worker who's going to bring um, vast prosperity to these people. You can tell throughout the film, literally from the first scene, like we discussed, that Daniel is only in this for himself. He doesn't care about the town or the town's people. They're both purely in it for themselves in a way. They sort of have this weird obsession with power, and it ties into that theme of humiliation that I brought up earlier. I mean, there are several scenes throughout the movie at the oil rig, and then obviously at the end of the movie in the bowling alley, where both characters get this immense pleasure from physically and mentally berating the other people, the other
Yeah.
person.
And it's like throughout the movie, Daniel physically assaults Eli multiple times. And I think they feel like the only thing that's keeping them from success is the other one, or, from, I mean, they're both successful in their own way, but, like domination of the town. Um, and Daniel throughout the movie physically harms Eli, I think like what, twice before he kills him, but he is able to control himself. And then in the end, once he's lost his son and he's just basically this drunk on the floor in his bowling alley, he doesn't, it's almost like he has no reason to hold back in the end, and he just kills him and absolutely completely destroys him, like very gruesomely murders him.
Yeah. And we
And
and we found it funny in sort of a bad way how it's you can tell it's been years and years since Daniel and Eli first met, but Daniel and Eli in a way still holds that grudge against the other person. And Daniel, I think, finally realizes now that he's made it, he's made his millions, and that his son has left him. He can kind of get away with that final step of killing Eli because there's nothing holding him back anymore, like you've just said.
yeah, and I think at that point, it's almost like, he talked about how he wanted to make all this money so he could just be alone. And it seems like earlier in the movie, he didn't really have a drinking problem, but he seems to develop. I mean, I'm sure, he did drink, obviously, throughout the movie, but it becomes problems where he's not able to function towards the end. And I wonder if he realizes that that's not really what he wanted. Just like, he has this false brother who comes to him, and, whether he's his brother or not, I think this guy has good intentions. He's there, and it turns out he's not really his brother. But does that really matter? It's almost like you can see the narcissism in him, that he cares so much as far as the way he sees another person if they're a part of him by being related to him. Like, he uses that relation with HW in the end against him. Like, oh, well, you're not really my son. Almost like to make HW feel the way that he felt when his false brother admitted to him that he wasn't. Well, I guess he kind of caught him, but you know what I mean. Um, it's almost like he wanted HW to feel the way that he did, um, in the end when he, admits to him.
Yeah, and it's interesting that character of the brother because you never actually see Daniel as friendly to anyone, genuinely friendly to anyone throughout the movie. There are a lot of times, like when he meets the Sunday family, where he puts on an act, and as the viewer, you can kind of tell that he's acting. Um, but those moments with the brother seem like maybe genuine Daniel, if there is such a thing. And again, the movie never really makes it clear if Daniel is capable of genuinely loving the people around him.
Yeah. And we see, you know, when Daniel goes into the church after murdering what was his friend's name who was pretending to be his brother? I have forgotten his name. You don't remember either.
I do not. It'll
Anyway,
come back to me.
after he murders his fake brother, he of course is woken up by the man who takes him to church, he wants to dig on his property to put in his oil line. And he's talked into going to church in order to do this. And we've got Daniel in the church where Eli has this power over Daniel, have over Daniel before. And Daniel's letting him do this. And, he's hitting him in the weakest parts of him where he's like, I abandoned my son. And Eli feels like he has this power over him, but Daniel mentally knows that he's actually winning because he's not there because he chose to be there. He's there because he's gonna get to make millions of dollars because of that oil line. So it's almost like Eli feels this false sense of power over Daniel that he doesn't ever really have.
Yeah, and again, going back to the end of the movie, I think that's almost the director's way of telling us at the end of the day, Daniel does win because Eli has this sort of false victory over him in the church, but then Daniel has a very real victory when he bludgeons him to death in the bowling alley.
And not only does, like, he doesn't even, he makes him say that he's a false prophet and God doesn't exist or whatever. I think that's pretty much what he made him say. And not only does he make him say that, giving him this false hope, but he also just like completely crushes his skull in. So he couldn't even end there where Eli's basically, I mean, he might as well have killed Eli when he made Eli say that anyway, you know? And then he does kill Eli. So,
Exactly. And it's also important to note with that scene, this is sort of the final, I mean, it's obviously the final scene in the movie, but it's sort of this culmination of everything we've seen from Daniel, the narcissism, the humiliation, and everything else. But this is the first time that he doesn't humiliate him in public. I mean, there's no one else in that bowling alley with him. He just does this because he really doesn't like this guy. And that's interesting. That stood out to me as well.
yeah. Oh, and we had talked about the themes between Eli being I guess you would call him a pastor. I don't know. uh, being whatever Eli is in the
Pastor slash
church.
con artist.
Yeah, just wild. And Daniel being a drunk in the end. And this is in the 1920s, to my understanding. So, you know, there's prohibition going on at the time. And we kind of thought it was interesting um, that during prohibition, Daniel is this drunk, which, you know, in that time, it's even worse than we would think of it now because it
Mm-hmm.
was also illegal for him to be drinking.
Yeah, but
Just
again, it kind of goes to that sense of Daniel just not caring about anyone else. I mean, you get the sense several times throughout the movie that this guy thinks he's literally above the rest of humanity, with the exception of maybe HW and his fake brother back when he still believed him. But Daniel kind of operates in his own set of rules and laws. I mean, he kills two people throughout this movie. And the movie ends with him living in his mansion, presumably being one of the wealthiest people in the area, you know? So Daniel gets away with it all, but the movie makes it clear that in that time, and maybe even today, these rich and wealthy people can get away with almost anything. And that's
yeah.
what makes him so terrifying as a character in a way, is that there are no real consequences for what he does.
But do we really even know what happened? Like, he could have gotten arrested after he murdered Eli. He could have died himself. He could have just laid down and died. We don't really
Right,
know. Like, we get to use our imaginations in the end
right.
to decide, like, did the police find out that he brutally murdered this man? It's very possible. Did he go to jail? Did he maybe he just dropped dead himself after the film cuts? Like, we have no idea what really happened.
And
So
we'd be interested to hear as what you as the viewer thought happens at the end, because, like you've just pointed out, it's an incredibly open ending, and I feel like it really depends on the individual viewer to place their own ending in their head, and obviously that depends on your personal experiences and your beliefs on wealth and all those things. But overall, just a beautifully made movie, a lot to discuss.
yeah,
And Daniel Plainview is definitely one of the most incredible characters in modern cinema. And a lot of that obviously has to go to Daniel Day-Lewis and his amazing portrayal of the character.
definitely. And we would love to hear what you guys have to say, like you said. And yeah, do you have anything else you want to talk about?
I think that was it. I think we both highly, highly recommend this movie. A lot to analyze and discuss on your first viewing. But it's definitely a movie everyone can connect to, and even though it's a story that takes place about 100 years ago, it's still incredibly relevant today.
Absolutely. All right. Well, send us any questions you have. We'd love to answer them. Send us any movie requests. This is our first podcast, but we are very excited to keep making them.
Thank you for listening, and we hope to have you tune in next week as well.
All right.